What does Warhammer and Studio Ghibli have in common? Well, besides being just full of weird little dudes, they both actually involve quite a bit of painting, with each frame of these beautifully animated movies being hand painted with a very particular type and brand of paint. And I want to see if it works on miniatures. I'm going to be using this set of 24 paints, although there are some larger ones too. One of the first things I notice is just how vivid and pigment rich all these paints are. The viscosity has a bit of variance from jar to jar, but overall these are all pretty thickly bodied. They're called poster paints, which I'm not really familiar with, but after playing with them, they're super similar to a gouache, which is probably easiest to think of as an opaque watercolor. Thinning down super well, but also able to be used with a consistency more like acrylic paint, creating really nice, rich, flat colors. Since there isn't a dark brown in this set, I'm going to mix some up with black and burnt sienna, adding water to thin it down. While mixing, I did notice the paint is slightly gritty, but overall it flowed super well as I applied it all over to things that will end up as an earth tone, such as the big skull, but mostly focused just on hard to reach areas I won't be able to get to later. For a model, I'm going to pick this little goblin. He's a whimsical little guy that I thought fit in with the overall theme of the video. Once that dark brown base coat is done, I'm going to move on to the goblin's skin, for which I've chosen this viridian color as its base. The footage doesn't really do it justice, but it's a super rich and beautiful dark bluish green color, and overall I enjoy how straightforward the naming of the paint is. I add some water to thin it down and start applying it to the model. Since the skin area is a bit small, I'm naturally just using smaller brush strokes, which kind of gave it a patchy result compared to the previous step. When I went back over to try and build up more opacity and better coverage, I realized how badly these paints reactivate when more paint or water is added, and I'm sort of just removing the previous layer instead of adding paint. This is super not ideal for miniature painting, so when it came time to add this carmine red to the robes, I mixed it less thin and was super intentional with my brush strokes, using the red to highlight the previous brown and making sure I didn't go over the same spot twice. If I absolutely had to though, I just tried to make sure there was a solid amount of paint on my brush, and that seemed to deal with the worst of the reactivation, leaving some paint behind rather than just removing it. It's hard to really layer properly and get a more smooth blend, resulting in a more stylized look. I tried to mix some lemon yellow into the red to create a highlight color, but it was a little too stark for me. Part of that is due to the color I mixed. I should have gone closer to red or desaturated it, but I decided to just paint over it with carmine, shooting for a more intense red rather than fighting the reactivation. I was a bit more successful layering this skaven's robe I painted off camera, keeping the highlights a bit bolder and direct, but also applying the second color while the first one was still wet. I still struggled with 100% coverage though, but overall really enjoy the color and saturation. I took this same idea of being more intentional with my paint strokes and moved on to the skin highlights, using Imperial Green. Once again, I was pretty dazzled with how vivid the color was here and how well it mixes with water, needing way less than I initially thought to get it nice and spreadable. And then I went ahead and applied it to the model, hitting the prominent areas like the nose and ridges around the ears, leaving the viridian only in the recesses. I was careful not to overwork this and instead tried to just hit everything with as few strokes as possible, as subsequent passes just muddied the result. This of course left chunky highlights, making it hard to really finesse the blends and get gradual increases. And this is especially so when it came time to do the fine details on the face. I used magenta to pick out the eyes and the inner mouth like the gums. I had to be really careful here since trying to cover up any mistakes is hard to do without building up texture or having to start all the way over again because of the reactivation. I took the magenta and mixed it with some imperial green, creating a warm gray, and painted the bag on his back along with the straps on his wrists. For the large skull and bone section, I used burnt sienna and added small amounts of water until the paint was thin and spreadable, but still very opaque. I was really happy with this section and felt like it was the most successful I had been with the paint so far. I made sure my brush was loaded up and just very lightly began sketching over the raised surfaces, building up volume, and trying to pick out the overall shapes with single passes. I really had no activation issues during this stage and the paint flowed off super nicely. I wanted to try out something new with the poster paint and see if I could do a bit of dry brushing with yellow ochre. When I did this like I typically would with other paints, I found that I was sort of just scrubbing the previous layer away, leaving smudgy looking yellow ochre behind. Instead, I found that if I loaded the brush with more paint than the standard dry brush, I was getting a better result. With most of the large sections out of the way, I wanted to really see what else the poster paints were capable of without having to worry about the reactivation. I wanted to base coat some of the areas with a more typical acrylic paint, so when I layered the poster paint on top, I'd at least have a solid base coat to fall back on without having to worry about lifting it up. For the base, I gave it an all-over coat of NATO black and then added incremental amounts of white for the highlights, picking out all the texture. For the mushroom on the base and along the spine, I jumped from NATO black straight to an off-white with pure white highlights. The plan was to use this as a base and add a thin layer of poster paint on top, using the strong saturation to create some glowy fungus. The little flying squigs got a base coat of imperial blue before moving on to the metals. For the goblin's two weapons, I used Iron Warriors from Citadel. It's a pretty thick paint, but once it's thinned down, I think it's a super nice dark metallic. I also make sure to pick out the little charms and the one tooth on the skull. I chose cerulean blue and attempted to layer it over the imperial blue on the bat squigs, but despite trying to use intentional flat strokes on areas like the wings, I couldn't help but get a really chalky and splotchy finish. On the plus side though, this paint reactivating means I can just use water like an eraser and scrub it all off. Instead of the cerulean blue, I opted for cobalt violet, and this time I dry brushed it on, loading the brush up with more than your standard dry brush and applying it all over the bat squigs. To finish them up, I used magenta for their eyes. I placed a small dot and found that it sort of brightens as it dries, ending up a lighter color than when applied wet. The teeth were painted with a small section of ochre. Once dried, I blended it into the base coat by using a brush with just water, dabbing it onto one end, and using that reactivation to my advantage for once, and reducing how stark the teeth looked. For those glowy mushrooms, I take some light blue and thin it down, making it runny and wash-like, but thanks to the natural saturation of the paint, still a bit opaque. I brush it on, pushing it around so that the light blue color settles into the recesses and just tints the light parts of the base coat a subtle blue, emulating a glowy look. This effect really sings when dialed up though, and I really liked this use of the poster paints. You can see on this Warlock Engineer how I've rendered all the warpstone and different glowy areas as just black and white. A really high contrast look that I then apply a thin layer of French blue over. I pull it away from the brightest points, tinting everything blue and letting the underpainting do a lot of work. Almost everything else here is painted with typical acrylics, meaning I can go in with a wet brush and continue to manipulate the poster paint, removing some and allowing the white to shine through on the brightest points, creating that high contrast look that strong light sources have. We keep up this sort of fluorescent look by thinning down some chrome green to a runny consistency and dabbling it around the stalagmites and cave floor, sort of creating a vivid, overgrown algae look. Again, since this was base coated with acrylics, where that green color is too bold or needs a little knocking back, I can go in with a wet brush and disperse it, thinning it out on the surface or just removing it entirely. I like how thin this paint can get while still remaining vivid, allowing it to run into all the textures but still keeping its saturation, almost like a super saturated wash. As a finishing touch, we're going to add a bit of rust to the metallics. With a more typical metallic paint used, we can apply the poster paint in small dots or more splotchy pools on top, and then also remove it as we see fit, staining the metal a rusty color or even erasing it altogether. The way the poster paint thins down also lends itself well to weathering, as we can add saturated rust colors into crevices and areas where the elements would collect. So, would I recommend these? Well, probably not for painting miniatures. Throughout my experience using them, there's no doubt they're very cool paints and really nice for their intended purpose. They dry quickly and very matte, and that super rich and vivid color kept calling me in like a siren song, only to dash me against the rocks that is reactivation, making them super not ideal for miniature painting, which usually involves a lot of layering, or at least the way I typically paint does. I think there's no doubt that somebody else could find something great to do with these, and I'd love to play around with them a little bit more. I think my favorite use for them was lighting effects and the glowy parts like the mushrooms and especially the warpstone elements on the Skaven Engineer. The really saturated colors flowed really well over the underpainting, and I enjoy that they could also be manipulated continuously with the reactivation. That being said though, I think the same thing could also be achieved with oils, so I'm not sure they're really filling a niche or solving a problem that something else can't do better. I think overall I didn't achieve a lot of color harmony on my model though, and should have mixed my colors together a bit more. The colors are super nice though. The vividness and pigment saturation immediately jumped out to me, and I'm curious if mediums or something could be added to them to help the reactivation, or if that would even be worth it since there's so many other nice paint products out there. Even though this was a bit of a flop, I still had a lot of fun playing around with a new paint, and I hope you enjoyed watching it. Thanks.